Welcome to the Deconstructed Woman podcast, a podcast about breaking down barriers between women, exploring and sharing perspectives of each individual woman's experience, and discovering what we have in common and what makes us different. Hosted by Elisa Marie and Joji.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of The Deconstructed Woman, hosted by Alyssa Marie and Joji. Today, we're going to be talking about eldest daughters and the role that they play in a family. And I saw this article in Chicago Tribune on Sunday, May 5th. And the name of the article by Catherine Pearson caught my eye. It said, "Eldest daughters have moment in viral spotlight." And when I started reading about it, it talked about the fact that I guess that eldest daughters have had a TikTok that sort of went viral and it's just been watched by a lot of people. And this was a TikTok video that Katie Morton, she's a licensed marriage and family therapist in California, put together. And I guess it just had a lot of people, over 6 million people watched it, or what was watched over 6 million times. And so as I read the article, I shared it with Alyssa because she's an oldest daughter and she has an oldest daughter in a siblingship of 4 children. And I was a middle daughter and the only daughter. And so I just thought that this might be an interesting conversation because they do start to talk about in the article about, is it really about being the eldest girl, or is it really about birth order and what that being the eldest carries a certain responsibility with it? I think that we can argue that if you are a female and the eldest daughter, or maybe any daughter, that there's a lot of responsibility associated with you. But I'm going to bring Alyssa into this conversation because she's had firsthand experience with being the oldest daughter. And I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa to give me her perceptions of this article and the conversation that we had prior to coming on live.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of things that come to mind. So we'll have to maybe flesh some of it out because I think that I do agree with the idea that there's a lot of responsibility placed on the eldest child. In a lot of ways, they pave the path for the other siblings. And I think I was actually reading an article the other day that was talking about how if there's multiple children in a family, the first child has that experience of being an only child until the next sibling comes. And they have to struggle with the understanding that they now have to share their parents' love and share the home and share toys and things like that. Whereas subsequent siblings have the opposite, where they're always other kids there. And so they just understand that, like, sharing and things like that. Not that they adapt to that any easier than any other child, but as the third or fourth or more children come in, there's already established that there's multiple siblings. And for me, I think that was very much the case. So I was 6 years old when my sister was born. And so I was already in elementary school. I had 6 years of being the only child, and I had big shoes to fill. The expectations that my parents set for me were very high. And so I think that some of the characteristics that I have, I think are universal. And I would be curious to hear what other people who maybe had that experience too of being the eldest daughter would say. But I would say that some of the things that I'm a perfectionist, I am an overachiever. There's a lot of characteristics that kind of came out of being older than my sister. And the message that was given to me was like, you have to be responsible. You have to show your sister how it's done. You have to do all of these things, whether they were explicitly stated or not. That's how it looked for me in my household. And that's something that carried into now for me. So I don't know for you with being the oldest daughter, but not the oldest in the siblingship. How was that similar to you for you or different, or what did that look like?
Yeah, I do think that it was very similar for me because my older brother and I were like Irish twins. We were very close in age together. And he didn't really have the opportunity to be the only child for very long. And I was the baby, or the youngest. for 9 years before my younger brother was born. And so I had that role for a long time. And it was really stunning when my younger brother was born. He was like my first child in many ways because I was really involved with raising him. But at the other hand, I also didn't know what to make of him because I was the youngest for so long and I was the baby of the family. And so that was displacing my role when my younger brother came around. But on the same token, I was the one who was the responsible one. There was definitely this expectation that my brother didn't have to be that person. Like I was the girl, I had to make sure that everything got done. And even though my brother was older, in many ways, I felt like I was the oldest. And before you and I started recording, we also talked about the different family roles and about I definitely, once I learned about the different roles, I clearly identified myself as the hero child. Like I had to be the award winner. I had to be the one that made up for if my brother fell short, then I was going to do that. And I think that I really rose to the occasion. I would say that I can stand back and say that I was obnoxious about it just because I did have a sense of responsibility and so much burden put on me at a very young age, making sure I would have the key to get into the house because we were latchkey kids. And my older brother would always forget the key. And so then at a very young age, I had to be responsible for carrying the key. And that I remember as a young child, that being like a real burden and not wanting to let anybody down and not fail my parents and not be sitting on the front porch for 2, 3 hours until my mom got home from work. And I definitely, that's where I'm challenged when I read this article to really say, is it really about being the oldest child, or is it also sometimes that girls are just expected to have more responsibility? No, I will say that I'm married to an oldest child and he's the oldest out of 3 kids. And he feels like he had a lot of responsibility in terms of protecting his younger siblings and making sure they were okay. So that is definitely an aspect that I remember my parents putting on my older brother in terms of protecting and making sure we're safe and making sure that nothing happens to us. But that's what I remember. I can imagine, Alyssa, that you might have had both of those roles as being the eldest girl as well as the eldest child. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of the responsibility, and again, especially since I was 6 years older than my sister, I I was chuckling as you were saying that because I think the other dynamic that I see is through my own children, and we were talking about that before we jumped on, is that my daughter is the oldest, and she cracks me up because I've said a lot of times, like, she's a mini me. And I was laughing because she has the house key. So very similar to what you were describing. Like, naturally gave her a house key and didn't give my son a house key. One, because she's 9 and he's 6. And I was like, okay, you're 9 years old. I trust that you get you and your brother into the house with the sitter at the right time. But I think that that natural response, I didn't even think about it. Like, it wasn't something that I consciously was like, oh, I'm going to put this on my child. It just was like, she's the oldest. So this is what we do. But I think that, again, it probably there's some kind of expectations that I set for her very early on. And a lot of times, again, I think those were the same that my parents put on me. I expect my daughter to be a good example to her siblings. I expect her to show them how to behave, how to sit when we're doing things so that they have a model for that. And I think my husband and I try to model that as well. But I think that a lot of times we see her as the model because she really sets the tone for our household. If she's all over the place, which I experienced very recently because she was away for a week with my parents and she just came back yesterday and she set the tone for the household, it was pure chaos. And so I had to have a talk with her and say, hey, I need you to be a good example to your brother and sister because it's getting a little too out of hand. And she said, it's really hard to have that such a strong responsibility on my shoulders. And so she very eloquently will tell me when it's too much. Again, it's a natural thing that I didn't even think about that I am now perpetuating that same cycle in my own family.
Yeah. And I think that it's just a natural occurrence of things. I think when you have multiple children, and I guess I could also say having an only child, I definitely believe that we put a lot of responsibility on the only child because there was really nobody else for her to lean on. And so she was it. And so she had a lot of, I think that very differently. We actually probably didn't put a lot of responsibility in terms of coming home and having the key or whatever, because until she was 12 years old, she went to a babysitter because she was too old to go to kinder care anymore. And so then we got her after school care. And so she was always with other people. She was never really home alone because that made me uncomfortable. And so interestingly enough, I think maybe there are some chain differences with her. I do think that we expected her to be more mature and act more adult like because there was no room for goofing off, but it wasn't necessarily because she was had to act a certain way with us. But I will say that when we would get all the cousins together, that was definitely something that everybody entrusted her to do. She was supposed to make sure that everybody behaved and that things didn't get out of hand. And I will say that so when we were with family, I think the eldest child had that responsibility. The issues that the article goes into about the three sort of traits that come out of the eldest daughter, as the article quotes, is intense feelings of familial responsibility, people pleasing tendencies, and resentment towards siblings and parents. And so, not to put words in your mouth, Alyssa, but do you feel like any of these things sound familiar to you, or that it's something that could be related to being an eldest daughter? Or do you think that other people could also have these same issues for other reasons like birth order or such?
Yeah, as you list them off, so definitely the responsibility to the family. I think that resonates with me as I hear that. I'm like, yeah, that's definitely something that I think that happens for individuals, especially in on the eldest role. The resentment towards the other siblings, I think that's something that it's probably unique to different individuals. I don't know. I don't know if it looks different, like if your siblings are closer in age, because again, like I was in such a different phase of life. I didn't play with my sister as much as like I probably should have because like I said, I was already in elementary school. So I was now reaching out and playing with other kids and had school friends and play dates and things like that. And so like I didn't resent her because she came and I was like, cool, I have a sister, but we were just always in two different phases of life. So it never felt like she was taking anything away from me. But I imagine if siblingships are closer in age, or like you have to I just imagine it looks different for other people. That part doesn't necessarily sit with me. What was the third one?
People pleasing tendencies.
Yeah, and that's one. Yeah, sorry. I should have remembered that one because I was like, nope, that one doesn't also resonate with me. But I think that I don't have people pleasing tendencies. I have parent pleasing tendencies. And so I view it as very different. I want to please my parents and I still do to this day. And it's something I struggle with because I have to recognize that my capacity is only so much. Like I very much want things to look a certain way for my parents, but that parent pleasing is 100%. But when it doesn't really translate to how I interact with other people, when I see other people or how I conduct myself in work or social relationships, I don't really try to please other people. It's very specific for me to my parents. So that's how it pans out for me. But I'm curious to hear how it looks for you as well.
Thinking about probably once again referring back to my older brother and my husband, I think that they would not agree about the people pleasing. I think they're pretty independent minded. And for whatever reason, I think that they went away from that. Could be because they're boys or men versus a female. But I will definitely say that I've heard both of them say more than once that the oldest has the hardest role because they paved the way for everybody else. They're the ones who have to do the first and then the younger kids under them get what they want. And that, so being the first is always the hardest, being the eldest is really hard. And then I think we already talked about the responsibility and feeling like that is the case. And I also feel like they would go as far as to say that their parents also made different rules for the younger ones than they when they were the eldest. And so I think that definitely there are certain things. I do feel like the people pleasing thing might. Do you think that the people pleasing is more tied to being a male versus a female, or do you know men who are as people pleasers as much as women?
I don't think that I really know, like, them because I think it's 2 different things, like, you mean from the perspective of the eldest child or just in general?
I think it might be, I guess I'm first of all, I'm thinking in general, just because I think most of that trait is associated with a woman. But then I was trying to think about men that I know who are also people pleasers, and I can't think of a lot of them. The ones that I think of are they're usually they are all like ethnic, like they are immigrants to this country, and they are also the hero child because they're trying to make their parents happy because of the choices they made, not necessarily because they were and not they weren't the eldest either. It was just focusing on the people pleasing. I think it was very different. And it could have been because the oldest wasn't buttoned up very well. And so they ended up having to make up for that somehow, I think. But there's not that many men that I describe as being people pleasers either that I know.
I don't know a lot of men either, that I would necessarily classify that, but I do think it goes back to when the things that I've read about parenting and stuff like that. I think that it is more classified as a woman's issue, people pleasing and trying to make people happy, whether that be within your own family dynamic or at work or things like that. And I think it ties back into some of the topics like burnout and whatnot. So I think that's what I've heard in the circles that I follow and things like that is that if you have those people pleasing tendencies, you really have to shut that down in some ways or at least reduce it because what it does is it makes you say yes to so many things in wanting to please everybody and it's going to cause a lot of problems. So from that perspective, I can see again leading that into the idea of the hero child like you were describing or somebody like me like the overachiever who wants to do things. But again, I'm viewing it differently from my specific experience, which is not necessarily to please other people as much as I'm pleasing two specific people. But I do see the connection, though I don't know that it's from my own perspective. I don't think it's true for everybody. I don't know the universal thing, but I do think that somebody who wants to ensure, like, feels responsible for their family may also want to ensure everybody's happy and that it does come out from time to time for me, but it's definitely not something that I don't know. Maybe it is more prominent than I realize and I'm just not fully aware of it, but now my wheels are turning, so I'll have to look at things maybe from a different perspective.
Yeah, I think that in the situation between you and your sister, they say that if there's more than 4 years between siblings, then they're two different sibling groups. And both of you were like only children in certain ways because you had your parents all to yourself for a while. And while you were gone and interacting with other kids, she was also the baby for on her own as well. And so, yeah, I think that does lead to a certain dynamic where even though you're responsible and you have to care for her probably in certain ways, you probably were pretty independent of each other in certain ways. Whereas, like my older brother and I are so close in age, more similar to the ages between your kids, probably 2 years or something like that. And then there was this large gap between my older brother and my younger brother are 10 years apart. And then my younger brother and I are 9 years apart. And so it was very different dynamic because he definitely was we were absolutely responsible for him and making sure he was okay and stuff like that because my parents were working and trying to keep the home afloat. And so, like, when we went to college, we took him with us to college if he was out of school. Like, we were the babysitters. We took him everywhere. And so I just feel like that when you have multiple children or you have 3 or 4 kids, I think that just happens, like you were saying in your family, where they all play together because they're just one group and they're pretty close in age to each other. Do you think that there's anything else about, I don't know if you have friends that have a lot of eldest daughters in their sibling group, they're the sort of the lead. And do you see any trends between your friends and those any commonalities between you and other families that have daughters who are the eldest?
I think that what I see, and again, in when I see videos, because I watch a lot of videos, there's a lot of comedians out there that talk about siblingship, and like the eldest is always the responsible one, the one that overachieved. I think that those are the two words that come to mind when I think of eldest child. It's interesting because my husband is also an eldest child. There's only 4 years between him and his brother, but he very much does not encompass that kind of like behavior and mentality in a lot of ways. And so it's again, would have to interview him to get his perspective. I don't know what it looked like in the home very early on, but I know that he unfortunately married me, who I really focus on doing things a certain way and whatnot, and he's along for the ride in some ways. I think that it does look different for each family, but the things that I see, the kind of consistency across the board is that family responsibility and setting the bar very high for others.
Yeah, I'm even thinking about if you have friends whose eldest is a son, and is there differences between those families, or maybe the sample size is too small, I don't know, but I'm just trying to think about that. But I think ultimately as we end this conversation, I feel like it is very difficult to tease out gender and birth order, and if you're an only child, if you have lots of years between your siblings or if you're close together in age. I think all of those things make for a very unique experience for the individual. And so I think it's hard to generalize for a whole group of people. But I thought the article was interesting and just thinking about what we do put on our children, especially if they're girls and they happen to be the oldest, and how much we need to care for them because in certain ways we are just reinforcing the same burden we talk about as women, right? And we have to look at where did that burden that we experience or that burnout, where did we learn that behavior? And are we feeding into the same cycle of raising our daughters to be similar? And is that fair to them? And are they going to be walking in our same path 20 years from now, 30 years from now? And I guess that is what we all need to consider as we step back and say, okay, this wasn't just accidental how we became this way. And how do we help the next generation of women be more balanced and be a little bit more selfish and be a little bit less responsible and be a little bit more carefree? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's that hits home so much so for me. And I think that I 100% agree with that. I think that it's hard because I fall back into those same patterns that I was brought up with. Like I said, I very much put that on my daughter, but I have also stepped back and said to her, "But it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to." I remember very vividly, like when she first started kindergarten, we got a book about like beautiful mistakes. And I think I've mentioned it before in on the podcast, but it was one of those things where I was really trying to encompass like it's okay to mess up. You don't have to be perfect. She still just naturally came home sobbing one day and I was like, "What's going on?" She's like, "I got a 9 out of 10 on my math." And I was like, "Oh no." Like that whatever the influence in those first 5 years of her life like, already solidified, and she was devastated. I was like, "It's okay, like, you tried your" like, I'm trying to give her encouragement to break that perfectionistic mentality, but she already had it, like, fully ingrained by 5. So, I think that now I'm working with her to really say, "It's okay. You know what? Go have fun." And I do the reason she was gone for a week is because that's her vacation. Every year, she goes and stays with my parents and she always comes back saying, "It was so nice to not have to watch my siblings for a week." And so I try to really make sure that I give her time where she doesn't have to be responsible, but I do need the extra pair of hands from time to time. And that's only going to last until her younger siblings are able to hold their own as well. So I imagine that hopefully that would lessen everyone gets older. But in a lot of ways, that very much is something that I'm trying to counter. But I only more recently became aware of it. And I think that's part of that's part of the process of recognizing again those transgenerational patterns that we carry through. I think that there's maybe more here to talk about, but like you said, we'll wrap up here. So Joji, if you don't have any other thoughts, you can close us out and we'll go on to our next topic next time.
Yep, happy to do. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Deconstructed Woman. We love to hear your feedback. I'm sure there are many eldest daughters of a sibling group out there listening. We'd love to hear if you agree or disagree with anything we've talked about. And please feel free to reach out to us using our email address at thedeconstructedwoman@gmail.com, or you can reach out to us with our Facebook page or to contact either us if you know us personally. People seem to be more comfortable doing that than putting a post on the Facebook, and we still share the information when we can. And I do wanted to give a shout out to a couple people who responded to our recent published podcast about the family pet. That seemed to really garner some feedback. So thank you for doing that and keep those comments going. We love it. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to really get into and talk about and chew, we'd love to hear from you about that too. So for Alyssa Marie and myself, thank you for listening. And until next time, take good care of yourself. Bye. Thank you for listening to our podcast, The Deconstructed Woman. If you like this podcast, please share it with your friends, rate this episode, or subscribe to be notified of all new content. We want to hear from you, our listener. Do you have thoughts on the discussions we're having? Want to share topic suggestions? Or want to join us for a topic that you're passionate about? Contact us at our email address, thedeconstructedwoman@gmail.com.